students felt and what staff understood of their lives. So I've talked about the nation state, I've talked about some kind of differences within countries, but there were some other axes of difference that I thought it might be useful to mention. First of all, academic discipline. Typically across all of our European countries, social science students were more politically engaged than students studying other subjects, which might be unsurprising. And so the way in which that kind of civic construction or citizen construction was understood differed a little bit by discipline. And also it's quite interesting that across all 6 countries, there was a strong view amongst students that those students studying STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering and maths, were seen by wider society as superior learners. And so those studying arts and social sciences felt that, you know, they may often be discriminated against because they were studying subjects that weren't seen as so hard or as worthwhile. We also saw some differences by the university or higher education institution that students were attending. Now, I think in many of the European countries, it's quite difficult to disentangle this from social class, because when you have differences amongst universities, you often have more privileged students trying to secure access to the kind of higher status, more prestigious ones. But I suppose when we looked at our institutions, we did see differences in how the transition construction was understood. In higher status universities, that was often understood as something that was kind of quite normal in the family and expected thing that you did on the route to adulthood, whereas in families where they paid work to support yourself as a student, you're very likely to have less time to devote to things outside your studies. So, for example, taking civic action. So a big difference there. We also heard from students, from staff, from others about how feelings of stress were often linked to social class profile. The difficulty for poorer students of juggling paid work alongside other things, but also the kind of stress of what in the literature is called like habitus disconnect, of going into an environment that you might be very unfamiliar with. You might not have any parents who've been to university, and the stress that that kind of transition can cause. And I think also we've argued that social class is also implicit in the way in which students are sometimes positioned as objects of criticism. So in many of the policy documents, there was this sense that, universities had lost quality as a result of massification and diversification, which again kind of, seems quite problematic, but it's that these new entrants to university that are being positioned in this kind of way as objects of criticism. So that's a kind of brief summary of kind of, what we found in terms of how similar or not students were across Europe. But I just want to now say a little bit about kind of, why this might be interesting or important. Because, I find it kind of interesting because it links to these academic debates that I was talking about at the start. But I think we would also argue that how we understand students does actually have quite a material impact on, their actual experiences at university. And I suppose in the project team, we took a materialist view of language, that language isn't neutral. It actually imposes limits on what can be said and whose views are legitimate. And so when we were looking at these constructions, some of the actual impacts of them were recognised by students themselves. So, for example, students in Denmark talked quite a lot about how they felt they were seen as lazy by politicians, by members of staff, within the media. And they talked about how that made invisible the hard work they were actually committing to their studies, the challenges of juggling paid work alongside their studies, and also that they felt under surveillance because they felt that they were continually being looked at about, whether they were being lazy or not. We've also argued in the book, I think, that if students, if their political action is seen as threatening, which we argue that it is in some newspaper articles in particular, this can actually minimise the impact of that political action that's taken. So there were lots of newspaper stories in Spain, for example, which focused on the violence used by Spanish students, not on what they were actually protesting about. And so, there's a sense that actually kind of, this focus on students as threat makes kind of the actual points they wanted to make through their political action kind of much less visible. And then I suppose the students who weren't studying STEM subjects worried about their futures. They picked up this sense that they were seen often by policymakers and by the media as less valuable students. And that caused them to worry about their transitions into the labour market. But I think as well as those those impacts that students themselves seemed aware of, there might be others that may still be very significant. So first of all, I think, if teaching staff are assuming that students are passive and they're instrumental and they're only interested in the job that they get at the end, perhaps that informs classroom practices and pedagogies, and actually having a kind of more nuanced understanding of what does actually drive students might be valuable in that kind of situation. I think also some of our data does suggest that because some of our actors, some of our interviewees had particular assumptions about students from lower economic groups, that perhaps reinforces inequalities through kind of processes of labelling, etc. And also perhaps some of those assumed generational differences, the fact that students these days act in these particular ways, may also reinforce generational differences within universities too. But I think, a kind of more positive note is that students themselves don't seem to be passive recipients of these kind of constructions. First of all, I suppose, during our fieldwork, it became very apparent that students were very aware of how they were seen by other people in society and were able to articulate quite clearly how they felt their experiences were different from these kind of dominant constructions. And also, perhaps as I've been illustrating, there were acts of resistance from students. So, for example, they contested the way in which they were positioned as only future workers by drawing on these kind of discourses, these Humboldtian discourses in Germany, in Denmark. And also by the way in which they weren't afraid to, assert themselves as enthusiastic learners and hard workers, to talk at length about, how important it was them to engage with their material in class and to work hard to ensure that they got the most out of their studies. And I suppose broadly, these kind of conclusions articulate with that body of work that I referenced at the start about how policy constructions don't simply map on to student subjectivities. There's the opportunity for resistance and for contestation going on here that I think our data speaks to. So just to conclude, hopefully this kind of, whistle-stop tour across Europe has, convinced you that actually our data does raise quite a lot of questions about assumptions that are made in the literature about European homogenization and the reconfiguration of Europe around an Anglo-American model. I think there are obvious kind of trends in this direction, but our differences, our data would suggest that actually there are still quite significant national differences that relate to the different policy environments, but also relate to the different kind of historical and cultural contexts of some of the countries in our study. So I think it kind of it supports the literature that has argued that student understandings can't simply be read off
because the results part is really clear to me. But about the methodology, I think it is really interesting. The first question I would like to ask, in these countries, you have collected data from only local students, as far as I understand. Were there any international students? This is my first question, because when you say they feel like active citizens, I'm curious whether international students also feel like that in their host countries, or these are only local students. And the second question is about methodology as well. I have conducted a study in Poland, and it was really difficult for me to understand local language because there are some policy documents in Polish and I couldn't translate them. I mean, because I couldn't reach them. They were official documents. So you have collected data from 6 different countries, and how did you deal with the language barrier, local language barrier? For example, focus group discussions, were they conducted in their local language or English? So my question is about your methodology. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, really good questions. No, I should have clarified at the start that we only looked at domestic students, home students, because a lot of my research is about international students, and I just felt that the issues would just be so they could be so different for domestic students compared to international students. And I think your example of civic engagement is a very good example of that, because I think in the UK, a lot of international students, for example, aren't entitled to vote, and the issues that they might be politically engaged about might be very different. So we chose to exclude international students for those kinds of reasons, to make it kind of more of a comparison. I guess also there are very different numbers of international students across the 6 countries in the study. The language question is a really important one. And yeah, I would completely agree about the importance of using the national language. So in Poland, Spain and Germany, we did all the focus groups in the national language. In the team, we had people who could speak those languages, although in Poland we employed a local PhD student who did most of the focus groups. I think that raises issues of its own about how, you know, transferable certain terms are across different national contexts. But certainly in terms of kind of, you know, getting the kind of data we wanted, we felt certainly with the students, it was really important to do them in the national language. The exception was with Denmark. I'd done some previous work in Denmark, and I felt that in Denmark, students' English, you know, even undergraduate students' English is so good that they would be able to participate. So in Denmark, we did the focus groups in English, although maybe if I was doing the study again, I might have done it in Danish, because I think, you know, there was quite a lot of nuance that perhaps we didn't pick up. And then in terms of the staff interviews, we did probably the majority of them in English, but not all, because of in the team we had some other languages. But I think it's a really important point, and I think although we did use the national language, I think then that does raise issues about whether terms are automatically transferable across the different countries, and we did spend quite a lot of time discussing, you know, those kind of linguistic issues. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Brook. That was very enticing, enlightening. I'm Professor Dr. Hazir in Sociology of Education. My first question was exactly the same that was asked, that you focus only on the local student in 6 countries, which shows there is a serious concern in these 6 countries about the local students and not about the international students, because studies have unpicked that international students are more focused and struggling with their studies as compared to the local student. That may be in Turkey as well, that's in Pakistan as well. The second question I was wondering on, that the other axis that you mentioned, the intersectionality of classes, was there any attempt with the other axis regarding gender? Because in Pakistan, in the last 20 years, girls are outperforming boys dominantly in the mainstream university, both in the STEM as well as in the social sciences. So was there any other axis along the gender that were focused, like who were more serious for their studies, girls or boys? And one small question that is that when it comes to the seriousness with the studies, and the future concern that you told in your presentation, we in Pakistan, we have like the natural sciences or the STEM students are having more concerns and worries about the future as compared to the social sciences. Their future is more secure in terms of the competitive exams and the non-governmental sector as compared to the STEM subjects.
Thank you. Those are really interesting questions. I'll just go back to the STEM one to start with. Yes, and I think we wouldn't say necessarily that that's kind of like, relates to objective fact in those countries. It was more kind of, I think because in all 6 countries, there's such a kind of strong social and political discourse about the importance of doing STEM. Everybody needs to do STEM. But I think that was affecting students' perspectives, because I think if I'm just thinking about the UK, people who get into particularly sort of political high office often haven't done STEM at all. Going to kind of Oxford and doing politics, philosophy and economics is the kind of, traditional way in which you become a conservative prime minister in Britain. And so I think, there's perhaps a disconnect between public discourse at the moment about the value of STEM and, actual labour market outcomes. So I think, it's not the case that those students are necessarily going to be disadvantaged. It's more that they thought they would, because they were influenced by that kind of public discourse that, everybody should be doing STEM, and it's, if you're not doing STEM, you're not a very clever student, that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect to it. But also, the difference with Pakistan is actually really interesting there. So it'd be good to hear a bit more about that. And then in relation to your question about gender, that was something that we were really interested in, and I suppose our assumption was that actually would kind of feed through in some ways, but we couldn't find any ways it did. So nobody really kind of talked about this, because we did ask in all of the interviews and focus groups, at one point we did ask about kind of, whether they felt understandings of students were differentiated, and then we actually listed things, including gender. And so even when prompted in that kind of quite specific way, very few people said anything about it, which I think, is probably a little bit surprising, because I think, again, in Europe, there is quite a strong discourse about, how well young women are doing, and, are they kind of excluding young men and that kind of thing. But that didn't really kind of crop up at all in our studies, which I think was kind of interesting. So I'm not sure I've got much more to say there. And yes, about the point about international students, I guess has already been addressed. But yeah, we just felt that there are a whole load of issues that are actually quite specific to international students that probably are deserving of another study rather than this one. Thank you.
I think we will have a last question, because it's already lunchtime and we are behind. If it is a quick question, over there.
Hello, Saima Sürmez from Department of Sociology, Başkent University. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. It's great and refreshing to hear that we're not talking about the quality of higher education, but students for a change, and I'm delighted that Arman Hoca has organized this. I had a very sort of reflection question for you. Did any of the higher education institutions that you studied have a meaningful engagement policy for the students in their policy processes about how they feel beyond teaching evaluations or beyond having a representative in their councils? Thank you.
Yes, I think probably. So one thing I suppose one thing we're interested in was sort of about political representation. So there were actually differences there in how student unions were seen and how they were kind of listened to by institutions. And I would say that probably in Denmark, there's a kind of a much stronger history of listening to students through the student union structure than in the other countries. And I think there, certainly students, there was a sense that, they were actually involved in those kind of structures, and there were ways in which they could kind of make their voice heard. However, as I was saying, it was also interesting that in Denmark, that was the country where students were kind of criticised most in the press. So our analysis in newspaper articles showed that in Denmark, student voice actually was referred to a lot more. So most of the newspaper articles, when they were talking about students, they did go and interview a student, and that wasn't really much the case in the other 6 countries. But that still didn't seem to sort of prevent this kind of criticism. But in terms of institutional policies, that wasn't something we sort of asked specifically about. I mean, I suppose it did kind of crop up in various answers. But I think, so for example, in the English institutions, quite a few of the teachers talked about, like having to have committees where students give their voice and that kind of thing. But I think, like I was saying, there was often this sense that actually students use those in quite instrumental ways, just to sort of focus on their teaching and learning, and that came up in a few other countries as well. So I think, and again, that was very much focused on the course. So I can't think of any instances where students were asked, in a kind of meaningful way for their views outside their specific course that they were studying. But because we didn't really ask a specific question, there may have been things going on that we weren't aware of.
Thank you so much. And if you don't mind, we close the session now. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Rachel, coming all the way from London to give this speech and for the speech as well. Thank you. Öğleden sonra oturumlarımız devam edecek. Öğleden sonra bir davetli konuşmacımız daha var. Profesör Doktor Ali Sınav, kendisi erkenden geldi burada. And I would like to give the plate and certificate to Rachel, together with the board of the Association of Higher Education Studies. Please, can I just call all my colleagues here to be here?